And we are going to jump right into it. So this is the plan for the evening. Our goal is at the end of this that you're going to understand the value and objectives of the technical interview from the employer's perspective. Why are they making you jump through this hoop? We're going to talk about the various kinds of technical interviews. We're going to talk about strategies, because I think this is the most important part, right? How we can respond to technical questions. And then last but not least, Arasu and I had talked about being cognizant of what gender bias is and how it presents in technical interviews. And I just realized that there are going to be some men here. I think you'll find this valuable actually, even as guys, because a lot of what we're talking about in this section is going to point to some of the frailties of men as well. So off we go. So first, let's talk about the values and objectives. What are technical interviews? And Arzu and I actually just had a conversation about this earlier today on Slack, because I think there are questions about what does it mean for technical interviews. The way that I define technical interviews is any interview or a portion of an interview where the employer is assessing your knowledge and skill set with specific questions. Now, this is going to take several forms, and we're going to talk about that in a few minutes, but I want to break this out a little bit because when you do a search for tips on how to ace the technical interview, and we'll be giving you some of those articles later, what generally comes up is the assumption that you are going to be tested on coding because you are headed to be out to be a software developer. Now we know technical interviews are used in a lot more places than just with software developers, right? So I'm going to expand on that. But I do want to point out that there are technical interviews, right, where we're actually testing you on your knowledge and skill set with specific questions. That is different than, say, a case study or a design challenge, which feels a lot like a technical interview. And the strategies actually to answer them are very similar. So you're going to feel that you're actually going to want to pay attention, even if you're not going to get a technical interview per se, but you're actually going to be doing a case study or a design challenge. And those are both different from the job talks that a number of us will do as PhDs when we are applying for, say, a research position. That's a little bit outside of the scope of where we're going tonight. So if we want to talk later about how to ace your research talk, your job talk, we'll have to do that under a different presentation, a different workshop, okay? So why do employers ask for technical interviews, apart from the fact that you're sure they're just doing it to mess you up? So we know that they're asking for technical interviews because they want to test and see if you actually know how to code in Python. They want to see if you actually have the lab expertise that they expect you to have, right? But there are other reasons for technical interviews, very important reasons for technical interviews. So believe it or not, when you are doing a technical interview, one of the things that they are looking at is how do you communicate? In other words, can you string a sentence together? Okay. Can you lay out your ideas in a coherent fashion that somebody else who is listening to you can follow? They're also going to check and see how you respond to challenges. So don't expect that every time you are in a technical interview that there is a clear answer or even that the question they're asking is answerable. All right. And this is really important because what they want to see is what happens when you get stumped. What happens when you get flustered? They want to see how resilient are you? How resourceful are you? Okay. And so these are things that you want to think about. You can make it through a technical interview without actually having answered the question if it's framed in a way that they want to see how you handle the challenges, all right? So don't just give up. Don't just throw up your hands and say, I can't do this. know that they're actually looking to see what kinds of questions are you going to ask? What kinds of things how are you going to respond when you are stuck? Okay. Um, they are going to be looking at whether there is team chemistry. So a number of technical interviews are going to have you working with the team. And they want to see, do you connect with the other team members? Would you be the right person to work with a group that is already assembled? And last but not least, they want to know how you handle feedback. So if they say to you, sorry, you didn't answer the question, they want to see what you do with that, right? Do you get all defensive? Do you get angry? Do you start crying? None of those are good ways to handle it, right? They want to see that you are absorbing that feedback and that you are in some way processing it in a productive way, right? At the very least saying, thank you. I hadn't thought of it that way. And by the way, if you're ever stuck when they're giving you feedback, or if you think they're flat out wrong when they're giving you feedback, the best thing you can say is, thank you. I hadn't thought of it that way. For those of you that are getting ready to take your orals where you may be sitting in front of your committee, practice that. Thank you. I hadn't thought of it that way. Okay. So these are all the reasons that employers will ask for a technical interview. So what do technical interviews look like? Well, they can come in a number of formats. So I've grouped them into 3 different categories. The first are the problem sets. Now, by the way, when they send you a problem set, they're not looking at team chemistry. You're going to do this by yourself. They're not looking for how you communicate, because more than likely you're just writing out the answer, right? You might show the logic. You might show how you coded several lines, but realistically, they're not really looking at all of those other things. Problem sets are in some ways the toughest, simply because they really are assessing, do you know what we need you to know? Okay. Now, problem sets, they're sent home. They may be timed. They can be untimed. They may even be monitored. So sometimes what they will have you do is, when you are prepared to take a problem set, they will have you log on to Zoom or some other platform where they can watch you. It's a little creepy, I'm not going to lie. But those of you that have taken finals on Zoom already have had this experience. Those of us who haven't still feel it's a little creepy. But problem sets can also be case challenges, just so you know. So while we're very familiar with problem sets that actually ask you a question and you have to write the code, or they ask you a question and you have to do the calculation or develop the algorithm or write the chemical reaction for it, right? On the other side of that, you can have a case challenge or a design challenge that is coming home as a problem set. And then what they'll frequently do is those are most likely to be timed and may very well even be monitored. And what will happen at the end of it is, so they'll give you, say, a half an hour to 2 hours to study the problem and then to write a solution. And usually when you write the solution, you're either going to write it in Word, or you're going to come up with a slide deck as if you were going to present it. Okay. But in either case, you're more than likely in a problem set at home not going to be presenting it. They're going to be reviewing what you submit back and grading it, if you will. Okay, now the second set of kinds of interviews is what we used to call the phone screen. Nowadays, sometimes they will do it via phone, but a lot more times now they're doing it via Zoom or some other online video conferencing platform, okay? And usually with a technical phone screen, it goes one of 2 ways. So one, they're either going to ask you trivia questions. So that might be something like, how would you do this operation in SQL, right? What does it mean when I say this kind of chemical reaction? Okay. They're questions that you probably learned about as a part of any number of your classes. And they're questions that you can answer, I wouldn't say necessarily in a sentence, but you can answer fairly quickly. And they're questions where there is most likely a right or wrong answer. Okay. These, by the way, can be asked by a recruiter. Okay. You don't have to have special skills to ask these questions, especially if there is a right answer and a whole bunch of wrong answers, right? Because they know what the right answer is. That's what they're looking for. But there's another way that this can happen in a technical phone screen, and that is called paired programming. And what paired programming looks like is we give you a problem, and oftentimes it is a coding problem, and it's showing up on either some sort of a software coding platform, or it is showing up in something as rudimentary as a Google Doc or a Google spreadsheet. And there's part of the code written or part of the algorithm written, but the rest is missing. And you are paired with somebody who would be on your team were you to work there. And you actually work through the coding together, or you work through the problem together. Now, here's what's really interesting when it comes to paired programming. This is where they really are looking for your chemistry, right? You are actually paired with somebody that you would be working with. So talk to that person. Ask that person questions. If you are stuck, ask for help, okay? That's why we're doing paired programming. If we weren't doing paired programming, if they just asked you to code something and they watched while you did it, well, then they're waiting to see what you can do, right? But if you're actually paired with somebody, they want to see what you can do with someone else, how you work well with others, okay? Now, last but not least, there is the in-person virtual interview. The in-person or virtual interview, I'm sorry. And what I mean by that is these used to be our site interviews, right? Nowadays, almost all of this is happening via virtual interview. And in this environment, and this is a much longer interview, right? In this environment, what you're going to find is a mix of trivia questions, paired programming, whiteboarding, case challenges, design challenges. You may even be asked to do a job talk, okay? More than likely, if you move into this stage, this is the final stage, right? This is the last round of interviews. And in this stage, you can expect to be sitting at your computer or on site for several hours. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, we're going to talk a little bit more about what this looks like. Oh, but I do want to take a step back and talk about what does whiteboarding look like. Whiteboarding used to be incredibly popular, and I'm hearing less about it now that we're in COVID, but it's still happening. So what whiteboarding means is you are presented with a problem, and it used to be in person, you would stand at a whiteboard and lay out your code or write out how you would work through a chemical reaction, or you would map out how you would solve a larger problem. You might be asked to lay out your methods if we're talking about a lab procedure, right? Nowadays, if this happens via Zoom, they are going to provide you with a whiteboard space. And we're going to talk a little bit about that because you all need to get comfortable with these spaces that you may have to work in. Okay. So let's talk about typical interview phases. And I'm sorry, I keep moving your faces all over my screen. I'm not sure if you can see that, but you're getting in the way of all the words here. So I picked a couple of different kinds of positions that you would interview, and then I laid out what the interview process might look like for you from the first moment all the way through to the point where you get the offer, okay? So let's talk about what it would look like if you're coming in with a master's degree and you are applying to a position that is fairly entry level for master's students, All right. And typically these are things like a software developer or a data analyst position, right? And these positions, by the way, are recruited very heavily. So when this happens, you probably have already talked with a recruiter to get actually, I take that back. A lot of you aren't. A lot of you are applying cold. I'm not going to say you've already talked with the recruiter. But the first people that you will meet with will almost surely be the recruiters, okay? So typically you can expect in one of these situations that you are going to start with a screening interview. And a screening interview is a 15 to 30-minute phone call, or now Zoom, with a recruiter. In this, even though it won't feel like truly a technical interview per se, be prepared. This is where they may stick in a few technical questions, okay? And let's be clear, if you are somebody that is looking at a junior scientist position, right? A scientist position that is looking at you, this can be in pharma, this can be anywhere in biotech, that is going to have you on the bench, right? They may also be in this situation, and their trivia questions will absolutely be asking you about procedures, about your knowledge of certain kinds of chemistry, right? About your knowledge of certain kinds of methods that you might undertake on the bench, okay? I always say to people, if you have a skill and you've listed it on your resume, be prepared to talk about it even in the screening interview, all right? So it's going to last about 15 to 30 minutes. It's going to be with the recruiter, but you may get some trivia questions. Once you get through that screening interview, then you're probably going to move to the next stage, which is either the problem set or paired programming. All right. We've already talked about what that looks like. Now, sometimes what they will do is they will give you a problem set before they even do a screening interview. When they do that, know that they're really looking to make sure that you have achieved a baseline of skills. Okay. And there's really nothing you can do. If you don't have those skills, you're not qualified for this job. You just have to accept that, right? But more often than not, we see the screening interview first, and then we have the problem set or paired programming second. Typically after that is a final round interview. Now, this can be different depending on who you are interviewing with. Occasionally, they will do a whiteboard problem or paired programming. This is, again, where they're really trying to see, do you fit in with the team? They're going to do a team interview with you. So the people that you are going to be working with day in, day out are probably all going to be on that Zoom call. Occasionally, they will break it out so you meet with a couple of team members. They might do duo interviews, or you might meet with them one at a time. But generally, if they're really interested in your technical skills, they're going to put everybody together in a room. They're not going to waste that much time to have each person interview you separately. You will definitely interview with a manager separately. Managers occasionally throw in trivia, but most of these interviews are going to be more behavioral, because at this point, they're really trying to figure out, do you fit well with us? Are you going to be a good fit with our team? And then last but not least, what you may see is they may do a team interview with collaborators and stakeholders. So for example, trying to think of the name right now. Think, Erin, think. Oh, at Snap. At Snap, not long ago in the last year, when they were interviewing for data analysts, what they were doing is they would bring in somebody from the business management team, somebody from the sales team, and they would talk with you as well as the manager interview and the team interview. And the reason for that was because while you're not going to work with these people every day, you are going to need to communicate with them ultimately, right? You're going to need to share your data insights with them. And so what they really wanted to see is, can you talk with people who do not share your technical background? Almost assuredly, this is an entirely behavioral interview if you meet with collaborators and stakeholders who are not a part of your team. Okay. Now they'll mix this up, they'll twist it around, but these are the general kinds of things you can expect to see if you're coming into one of those technical skills heavy entry level positions for a master's degree. Okay. Now let's flip to the other side and talk about if you were a PhD or postdoc and you're coming in to, say, a data scientist position, or you're coming in as a researcher. These are more mid-level positions. Some of the people in these positions do not have PhDs, do not have postdocs. They worked their way up either from the bachelor's degree or the master's degree, right? But this is not an entry-level position, and they're going to handle it differently. So you're far less likely in these situations to get a problem set. I don't even know that you're necessarily going to see paired programming. Occasionally you do. I see that more kind of when you're looking at a data science position where occasionally they will come in with paired programming, but very rarely are they going to talk about a problem set with you. The first round interview is longer. It's usually about 30 to 45 minutes. It can be with someone in HR. Occasionally it's with a recruiter, but it can also be with the hiring manager, depending on the size of the organization and whether this is a recruited position or a non-recruited position, okay? Now, in that first round interview, they may spend some time on trivia. They may, but they're probably looking for higher order thinkers at this point. So they're going to assume that they're not necessarily going to have you code in Python every day. They may not have you working in a lab where you're going to actually be using your skills. Instead, you may be more likely to be managing people who are going to be using those skills or talking with people who are going to be using those skills. Okay. So typically it's a little bit longer interview, and it might actually be with the person who will one day be your boss. Now, this gets a little wonky. So a lot of times now on Zoom, we're seeing only 2 rounds of interviews. So that means if you get through the first round, you're in a final round situation, okay? But this is going to be arguably a longer series of interviews than what's happening when you're coming in at a more entry level. Second of all, it doesn't always have to be all one day. So Riot Games is a great example of a place where they seem to bring you back several times over the course of several weeks or even months before you get that quote unquote final round interview. That said, there's something about the Zoom environment that they're really trying to just pack it all into one day. And you can expect that you're going to be on Zoom for anywhere from 3 hours to 9 hours. If it's 9 hours, God, please take breaks. Ask to take breaks. Do not try and sit there that whole time. But the final round interview can include whiteboard problems, and it frequently does. This is where you're more likely to see a case study. And what will happen is, or a design challenge, where they will give you a scenario or a problem. Sometimes they'll give you, say, a half an hour to read it or 15 minutes to read it, and then they'll let you ask questions. Sometimes they'll give you a half an hour, and then they'll expect you to sit down and start working through it, okay? Generally, they'll give you anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours, depending on how big that challenge is. So you may see a case study, you may see a design challenge. You may also see a job talk. And that is where you come in and you actually share your research with them in some way. Know that they may ask you to pre-circulate a paper. Know that they may give you 30 minutes to read a prepared paper. Know that they may want you to do it somewhat extemporaneously, which means you go in with a slide deck, but you're not supposed to have a paper in front of you. So they can vary, all right? But you are more than likely going to have an extended problem that you need to work on that can take anywhere from a half an hour to a couple of hours to work through and present. They're also going to have multiple team member interviews. So what you may find is that to some extent, this is, if they're going to talk about trivia, it's going to show up here. You may also actually have a paired programming opportunity because they want to see how you work with others. But a lot of times, multiple team member interviews are just that, where you're actually sitting down with someone for half an hour and they're asking you questions. You will definitely have an interview with the hiring manager. Note that this may actually be longer than if you're coming in at an entry level. So some of these can last up to an hour. And then you might also have this idea of talking with a collaborator or with collaborators or stakeholders. That will almost always be a group interview, just like the one that I just described. Okay. Know that when you get into these interviews, and this is whether you're on the master side, whether you're on the PhD postdoc side, know that you can, if you are meeting with multiple team members and you're meeting with them individually, they may ask you the same questions and you can absolutely answer with the same answers. All right. In fact, it can actually be to your advantage if you do that, because then everybody is hearing the same stories. Everybody has the same information. Okay. So let's talk about strategies to prepare for technical interviews. So before the technical interview, there are some things that you should do. First of all, learn as much as you can about what the interview is going to look like. So as soon as the HR person reaches out to you, or occasionally the hiring manager reaches out to you and says, hey, we'd love to have you interview. What times are you available, right? You want to ask who's going to be there, how long it's going to be, what kind of a platform it will be hosted in if it's going to be a technical interview, and what will be covered, okay? There's nothing worse than walking into an interview assuming that it's going to be behavioral, and guess what? It's a whiteboard. So I think sometimes we get so excited that we get the interview that we forget to ask any questions. Ask the questions, all right? Because that's going to give you an opportunity to really prepare, especially if you are going to be dealing with some sort of an integrated development environment, all right? So know what kind of platform they're going to ask you to work in. If it's a coding challenge, practice coding on that platform. If you're going to have to do a whiteboard presentation, practice talking through some complicated problems on a whiteboard, not the one that you have in your living room. Talk through it on the whiteboard platform they're going to ask you to work in. All right. That's really important because you're already going to be nervous. Adrenaline is already going to be coursing through you. You do not want to try and figure out what the peculiarities of these platforms are when you've got 3 or 4 other people looking at you, right? Waiting for you to answer the question. Okay. The other thing is, as I just said, practice. Find sample questions and work through them. And this is even true of the trivia, right? Know what kinds of trivia questions they're likely to ask. Make sure you know the answers to them. You can find a lot of these questions, interestingly enough, through Glassdoor. So if you go to Glassdoor and you click on the company and then you click on interviews, a lot of times people will load up the questions. Now, if you are applying for a job that is not recruited, so in other words, if they're not hiring 5 of you this year, you might not find nearly as many questions available, okay? But if you are applying for something like a software developer position at Google, guess what? They've got a slew of questions on Glassdoor just waiting for you. If you can't find those, there are a lot of other ways to find these questions. And what you can do is you can actually just ask Google, right? See if you can do a search in Google and see what comes up in terms of, you can do something as basic as technical questions for software developers, technical questions for um, pharma, sorry, it's late at night, pharma scientists, okay? Now, be careful, pay attention, even on Glassdoor. They may be sharing some questions with you that are not questions for your level, right? So make sure that you're not answering the questions. If you're applying for a position as a software developer, make sure that you're not answering the questions that were intended for a data analyst, because they're not going to ask you those questions, right? Make sure if you are applying for a data scientist position that you are not answering the data analyst questions, because those are going to be too easy for you. Okay. So pay attention to those things. If you are working, if you know you're going to be working a whiteboarding challenge, or if you know that you're going to be working a design challenge, try to find some of those problems. They actually have books and they have websites that will give you some of those and work through them. You may even want to sit down with friends who are also interviewing at that time and work through them together and see if you can strengthen each other's responses. Last but not least, I think this is something that we forget about quite frequently. Set up your virtual space, okay? So pay attention to not just the lighting. I think more people are better about that than I am. But pay attention to what's going on in your background. I worked with a student several years ago who was on the academic job market, and he is a historian of pornography. And so, as you might imagine, the bookshelves behind him were filled with not just the texts, but the paraphernalia that he studied. I think everybody was horrified when they saw not just one shelf, but several shelves of triple X rated films behind him. Okay. Even though he was a professor, or I'm sorry, he is now a professor, but even though he was studying porn as a part of his history degree, that's still hard to be confronted with when you are in an interview, right? So pay attention to what's behind you. Clean off your desk. And I know that that sounds crazy because they're not going to see it. You can't see what's on my desk right now. But you want to have a clean desk because it helps you think more clearly. You also want to have a clean desk because you want to have plenty of scratch paper there. You want to have plenty of your writing instrument of choice, okay? Whether it's a pen or a pencil, whatever you need, you want to have them all right there because you are going to want to lay out your answers before you actually answer. And scratch paper is great for that. The last thing I will say is make sure that you have plenty of water sitting nearby. Especially if you are somebody who is in that final round where you're going to be talking for several hours, you are going to get the worst cotton mouth. Make sure you have the water there. All right, let's move on. So here is a little fun challenge for you. By the way, this is a question that Google used to ask almost every one of their candidates across the board. So I just want you to think about this for a minute. How many tennis balls fit on an airplane? Think about how you'd answer that. If you have scratch paper, you can jot down a couple of things. All right. So I know a lot of you are thinking, well, that's not a technical question. That's like one of those mind teasers, right? Let me ask you this. How many of you immediately started calculating the volume of a tennis ball? Are there a few of you there? Guess what? that's the one thing you don't need to do to answer this question. Okay. How many of you looked at it and went, wait, there's not enough information here. Like, I can't solve this because there's not enough information here. Did a number of you start thinking that way? Because that's good. There's not enough information here for you to solve this problem, right? This is what I was saying to you before. How many of you said, I don't know, it's too late in the evening. How am I supposed to answer this? So did several of you? Because we're going to talk about that response. All right. So this is really an interesting question. And the reason that I bring this up is because it really does get to how we handle a lot of technical questions. Okay. So believe it or not, this is really not a question that requires you to do much math. This is a question that wants to see if you're aware enough to realize that you need more information. Okay. If you're brave enough to ask for that information. All right. And see if you're enough of a higher order thinker to recognize that this is not a math problem at all. This is a kind of a process engineering model, if you want to lay it out that way. Okay, this is a logistics question. And here's what's really interesting. In all of the years that I have used this question, the one person that answered it right immediately was a PhD in musicology who knew that she could never do the math. And that forced her to start to think about, like, well, how would this really work? Because here's the question. How are you going to get those tennis balls into an airplane? See? How are you going to get a whole bunch of tennis balls into an airplane? Are you going to stand outside the door and lob them in through the door? No, they're going to be packaged, right? So ultimately, this is a question that has you thinking about how are these packaged? And once they're packaged, what does the interior of an airplane look like? Right? If we have that data, then yes, you can go right ahead and do the math. But you'll notice if you can figure out how tennis balls are packaged, they generally come in a sleeve, right? And there are 3 to a sleeve. And then the sleeves would go in boxes. So what you really need to know is the volume of the sleeve, not the volume of the tennis ball. And you need to know what are the dimensions of the box. Okay. And then how you would fit all of those boxes into an airplane when you don't know what kind of an airplane it is, and you don't know what's inside the airplane. All right. So I brought this up because one of the challenges that a lot of engineers have, and people who are just really good at math, immediately go to the calculations because numbers are your friends. Numbers are not my friend. I am a historian. So it may be easier for me to say that to you, but yes, it is very, very normal that you're going to get tripped up by going straight to the numbers. Okay. So here's what we want to do during a technical interview. And this applies whether you're doing a problem set or not necessarily when you were doing a problem set, but if you were doing paired programming, if you were doing a whiteboarding challenge, if you were doing a design challenge, if you are doing a case study, okay? Ask questions. They want to see how you respond to missing information, and they want to see how you respond to things that confuse you. Now, interestingly, women tend to be better about asking questions. This is a space where we arguably have a psychological advantage. The question is, are we brave enough to ask questions in this situation, in this environment? Second thing I will say to you, think before you act. Use that scratch paper to sketch out some ideas and a structure for your answer, right? If this is a coding challenge, don't just start throwing code out there, right? Think about what the goals are. Think about how you would normally build build several lines of code in pursuit of a goal. Okay. If this is a systems challenge, by the way, and a number of you, especially those of you that are in ECE that are on the hardware side, maybe getting systems questions. Okay. Again, think about how you would lay out that response. If you are going to be somebody who is in a lab, think about how you would lay out your methods. What do you do first? What do you do second? What do you do third? Okay. It is absolutely okay, even if you are face to face with them and you're in a small room and you're nervous and you're sweating, it is absolutely okay to say to them, wow, can I have a minute to lay out some ideas? Now, they'll probably watch you while you're laying out these ideas, and that can be a little uncomfortable, but definitely take that time to get your ideas straight. Okay. 3, be organized. So if you are not in front of them, if this is a problem set, right? Or if this is something that you are sending back to them as a design challenge, show your work, lay out a logical structure or the steps to demonstrate what you are doing and why. This is particularly important, by the way, when we're talking about the whiteboard challenges. They want to see why you're doing what you're doing in the order you're doing it, okay? That leads to number 4, talk through your solution. If you are in front of them, walk them through it. This is where they really get to assess your communication skills, okay? And last but not least, admit when you don't know something. Now, this is something that most of our faculty will tell us this, especially in STEM. If you don't know something, don't bluff, because almost always the person on the other side of the table knows the answer, and they're going to know when you are bluffing, right? When you bluff, you lose all credibility with them, because the only thing that they can think at that point is, you're going to do this when you talk to a client. You're going to do this when you don't know something on our team. This could be really dangerous, right? So if you don't know something, admit that you don't know it. But here's the thing. When you don't know it, ask for help. Say to them, I can't remember the algorithm for this. Could you help me? If you don't think that they're going to give you that help, the other thing you can say is, I don't remember the algorithm for this. I don't remember the formula for this. So what I would have to do is I would have to go back to my notes, or I would have to go onto Google and find that, right? Okay. Because what they want to know is that when you are in their space, when you are working for them, you're not going to know every answer. Nobody does. They want to know how you're going to solve a problem, how you're going to get over and past a barrier. All right. So if you don't admit that you don't know it, they're going to know you're lying. And 2, if you don't know something, asking for help or showing them how you would find the answers tells us that you are going to be one of those resourceful people that when you come to work for us, you're not going to get stumped and throw your hands up and go, I don't know, I give up. Okay. So let's move to this issue of gender bias and the job interview. And I have to thank Arzu here for this, because Arzu played my research assistant for the past couple of days and pulled up some fantastic articles, which we're going to share with you, that really helped me think about how I was going to frame this for you. So here's what we know. Gender bias exists. So does racial bias, right? So does a bias against international students, people who are not American. These things happen. It's stuff that we have to confront, and we have to navigate, because we do not live in a perfect world, right? One of the things that Arzu pointed out that I had actually not thought about was the fact that biases exist both from the employer's perspective, which is what you're most concerned about, but also from the applicant's perspective. And by the way, from an applicant's perspective, we as women are our own best saboteurs. All right. So it happens when we start looking for jobs. When we start looking for jobs, women tend to only apply for jobs they know they can do. That narrows our field considerably. Whereas men, studies show, apply for the job they want, whether they're qualified for it or not, which is amazing. Because guess what? Sometimes they are qualified for those jobs and sometimes they get those jobs, but we as women don't necessarily apply for them. Okay. In other words, gender bias exists on our side too. We don't believe enough in what we can do. And so we just don't even do it. All right. One of the things that we see a lot of times in interviews, and this happens in both the behavioral and technical side of interviews, is that women will, instead of proudly trumpeting their accomplishments, will couch them in, well, my team did this. It's not I did this, my team did this, right? Well, I helped with them. Not I did X, Y, and Z in this project. I helped with this project, okay? And oftentimes employers will say that they didn't realize that this person was qualified because this person never showed them how qualified they were, okay? It can be uncomfortable, and this is true for men and women. It can be very uncomfortable to talk about yourself, but your work is incontrovertible. So if you are not comfortable with talking about yourself, with bragging about yourself, talk about the work, talk about what you have accomplished, because what you've accomplished is what you've accomplished. You're not padding it at all. It's what you did. Okay. Now, here's another thing that we know. It is more likely to see gender bias in behavioral interviews. And where we see this most is that women are far more likely to be asked illegal questions. So questions about your marital status, sometimes questions about your sexuality, definitely questions about your plans for a family. Men almost never get asked those questions. By the way, they're illegal for everyone. So whether you're a man or a woman, you shouldn't be asked these questions. When you get asked an illegal question, there are a couple of things that you can do. One, you can deflect. You can go a different direction and just not answer it. But two, you can actually answer back. You can say something like, why? Is that a prerequisite for this job? And a lot of times then people will laugh and go, oh, no. I was just curious if you were planning on having kids. Okay. Some people will deal with it with humor too. They'll say something like, oh my God, kids. I can't even imagine taking care of a pet, let alone a child. That doesn't mean you're not planning on having kids. It just means that at the current moment, you're pretty happy just being you. Okay. But those are questions that you are more likely to be asked as a woman, and you really shouldn't answer them, because a man can talk about his spouse, not a problem. But if a woman talks about her partner, what happens is there is an assumption that your work will be secondary to their work. All right. So in other words, if he gets transferred to Boston, you're going to leave and go to Boston. And that is something that is really unfair, but it's what's happening today. So you need to avoid those illegal questions. Okay. Now, this was something I did not know that RSU taught me about. So in technical interviews, gender bias shows up in problem sets. And the reason is because there are language issues. Women tend to be less likely to translate what they're talking about. Also, oftentimes there are problem sets that are set up that don't speak to us in a way that we understand, right? They're either off-putting because they only talk about men. Men are the only people that are used in the examples, or they're confusing because they talk about something that we may not share an interest in, like auto repair or Football. I happen to be a big football fan, but you may not be, and men are more likely to be football fans, right? More than likely, what you're not seeing is a question that is based in chemical reactions and baking, which might be something that women are more familiar with, okay? So problem sets can be problematic because A, they may not be set up in a way that women have a facility for that kind of information. B, they can be off-putting because they only use men as examples. And then C, sometimes the language is not clear. Women tend to read between the lines more often. And so where something that a man would read a prompt and go, oh yeah, I get it, I'm moving on. Women are more likely to go, but is that what they're really talking about? Is that what they really mean? Or are they talking about this, right? In fact, we get lost in our own heads. So gender bias is going to show up in problem sets more than it is going to show up in other kinds of technical interviews. That said, I would argue that technical interviews don't suffer that much from those kinds of problems. More likely, and this is really interesting, women are less likely to submit problem sets than men. In fact, one of the studies that RSU brought up that I thought was really interesting is it shows that if there is a problem and a woman takes it and a man takes it, and they both do badly on it, if they are given the opportunity to retake it, men are more likely to retake it, okay? If there are problem sets, women are more likely to just take themselves out of the running for the job altogether. So when I asked you that question about how many tennis balls do you put on an airplane, if you were somebody who put your hands up and said, I don't know, it's too late, I don't want to deal with this, don't let yourself do that in a technical interview. Even if the questions seem overwhelming, take a stab at it, okay? Force yourself to go through the process. You may be surprised at what happens on the other end. Now, some companies are trying to resolve gender bias. They're trying to do blind applications or blind problem sets where you have a number instead of a name, right? If there's this issue of women taking themselves out of the running because they see a problem set, that's not really resolving the issue of gender bias, right? Because women are just walking away from the test altogether. But what I think is really interesting here is women have historically done worse on the whiteboard work. And part of that is that they feel uncomfortable standing up in front of a group of people who are judging them, right? So what we are seeing is that some organizations are starting to take whiteboarding away from the equation. It's not a project that they're doing. And we're seeing a lot more paired programming or paired problem solving projects, simply because, and this is interesting, if they offer you that kind of opportunity, women tend to do better. Women tend to work better in teams. Women tend to be better collaborators, according to studies. So in things like paired programming or paired problem solving, they're finding that women can actually really excel. So they're trying to incorporate more of those kinds of exercises into their interview process. All right. Ultimately, the takeaway here is gender bias exists, and don't give up on yourself. Okay. So what we can do, if I haven't said it before, I'm going to say it again. Do not quit. In fact, if you feel overwhelmed or if you feel that you did poorly, you can do one of two things. One, you can ask for an extension. Two, you can ask for an opportunity to try it again. I recently had a student, she's actually in the humanities, she's a linguist. But she's brilliant and really is a computational linguist, okay? And she was given a problem set that on a regular day she totally would have been able to solve. But she got that problem set and immediately began to panic. And she's like, I can't do this. I can't do this. She actually wrote me an email. She's like, I'm looking at this problem set and clearly I'm not qualified to do this kind of work. And luckily I saw it. And luckily I sent her a response and I said, ask for an extension. And so she did. She asked for it. They gave her a week. She was supposed to turn it in within 24 hours. They gave her a week. And you know what? A couple of days later, she woke up and she was like, I can do this. I can do this. And she sat down and she knocked it out of the park. They called her when she submitted it. They called her at half an hour later and said, we want to schedule the next interview. Okay. So don't be afraid to ask for an extension. If you really feel like you blew it, ask for an opportunity to try it again. Strangely, I'm going to talk about another linguist who, on a campus interview for a faculty position, they asked her, what classes can you teach? This is a woman with 8 years of teaching experience. Not only has she taught at UCLA, she's taught at like 3 different Cal States and a community college. And she looked at them and said, Italian. And they looked at her and they did that long, slow blink. And in her backpack, right, her bag that she'd carried with her, she had the syllabi for all of these different classes. She was just so deer in the headlights, she forgot to answer, right? She forgot what she had. So she got in the car, she got home, she was talking with her partner. Her partner said, send them an email, send them links to all of these syllabi. So she sent them an email that evening. She said, I'm sorry, I really just responded badly to that question, but I do want to share all of these syllabi that I have. She's now teaching at that university. Okay. She got a tenure track position during COVID and she's teaching at that university. Don't be afraid to ask to try again. Now, we've already talked about this several times. Make sure that you ask questions. If you don't understand the prompt, if you're getting in your head, ask questions. If you can see there's missing information, ask questions. Ask targeted questions. Take a minute to think about what questions you really need to ask, because you're not going to be able to ask maybe every question you want to ask. And remember, this is a good thing. Okay. Now, this is one of the biggest challenges, is speaking up. So oftentimes women struggle with being soft-spoken. The other thing that we tend to do is we tend to end sentences as questions, if you know what I mean, right? So if you are somebody who does this, and my son calls me on this all the time, what we really want you to do is we want you to practice at home, because unfortunately, if you are soft-spoken or if you end every sentence as if it were a question, you are demonstrating that you are not confident in what you are saying. Now, we all know that that's not true. We know people that are absolutely brilliant who are soft-spoken, who have a ton of confidence. They just don't tend to really speak loud and proud, right? What you need to do is recognize this in yourself and practice it at home. It may mean that you scare your cat or scare your dog. I had a client not long ago who did this, who was like, the first time that I enunciated, my dog went straight under the bed. But practicing this, getting comfortable with either of those issues will allow you to come into an interview. And even if you don't feel confident, even if you feel confident as you've ever felt, it's going to sound different to the interviewers, okay? The other thing to think about is sharing your enthusiasm. So men, not generally asked to smile. Women can be. I'm not a big believer that you should smile if you don't want to, but there are other ways that you can signal that you are really excited to be a part of the interview process. And one of those things is to let them use words to tell them how happy you are to be here. You can say, I'm so excited for this opportunity. Thank you for having me. I couldn't sleep last night. I was so excited about this. I am really enthusiastic about the opportunity to work with you. So get those words into those sentences if you feel that you are not otherwise conveying your enthusiasm to be here. All right. I had a client who went through, was her final round. She had interviewed with this company 4 different times to get to the final round. They had asked her the same questions over and over and over again. And she had had the opportunity every time she met with them to ask them questions. Quite honestly, she was tired, she needed to pee, and she had been sitting there for 3 hours. Schedule breaks. So when they asked her at the end of that final interview, do you have any questions for us? She got one question out, but she's kind of tired. She said it kind of like this. She knew she probably shouldn't have done it. Not only did she not get the job, but when she reached out to them to ask for feedback, which is always a good thing, by the way, it's always a smart idea to ask for feedback. What they said to her was, we just didn't think you were really excited about being a part of this company. And she was like, how did they get that after all of this time that I was so energetic? You have to keep repeating and letting them know that you're excited to be there. All right. And then last but not least, we've talked about this. Recognize that there are illegal questions. Have a strategy so that you don't have to answer them. Okay. So with that, I'm going to ask if there are any questions.